All right, so the Conservatives want to introduce a bill in the fall. They want to change the criminal code so that immigration status is no longer considered in criminal sentencing. Here's Conservative MP Michelle Rempel Garner, the Shadow Minister of Immigration, announcing this new legislation today.
Today I'm announcing that Conservatives will introduce legislation to amend the criminal code and restore the value of Canadian citizenship by ending the practice of judges considering a non-citizen's immigration status in sentencing. Since 2013, a Supreme Court ruling has permitted judges to consider immigration status when sentencing. This has been seen in several recent high-profile cases. For example, a permanent resident received a conditional sentence after being convicted of trying to purchase sexual services from a 15-year-old, as a stronger penalty would have hindered him and his wife from obtaining Canadian citizenship. Another non-citizen in Canada on a visitor's permit was convicted twice of groping an 18-year-old woman's genitals at a bar, yet received a discharge to avoid a permanent criminal record and to allow for an appeal of their deportation. Anyone seeking residence or citizenship in Canada has responsibilities as well as rights. When it comes to sentencing non-citizens, Canada has essentially adopted a form of two-tier justice where judges can and have given lighter sentences to individuals who are non-citizens by virtue of this ruling. This offends all principles of fairness that should be foundational to our justice system. This is why, once the House of Commons resumes this fall, Conservatives will introduce legislation to amend the criminal code to rectify this issue. Our bill will add a section after Section 718.202 of the Criminal Code, which will expressly outline that any potential impact of a sentence on the immigration status of a convicted non-citizen offender or that of their family members should not be taken into consideration by a judge when issuing a sentence. I want to be very clear. The vast majority of Canada's immigrants and temporary residents abide by our law. But removing non-citizens who have been convicted of serious crimes is a no-brainer, and it's one which the Liberals have failed to act upon. By contrast, Conservatives will always fight to protect Canadians, the value of our citizenship, and the safety of every person who lives here. Becoming a Canadian is a privilege, not a right.
So, according to the Conservative brief, there was a permanent resident convicted of trying to purchase sexual services from a minor who received a conditional sentence, partly to avoid jeopardizing his citizenship application. Apparently, there was also a visitor who was convicted of sexual assault who was granted a discharge to avoid a permanent criminal record and preserve his ability to appeal deportation. This was all part of the Conservative brief. Look, I haven't verified these stories myself. While this brief says these people got reduced sentences because they were immigrants, unless you have the details of the crime and the judge's rationale, I think it is dangerous to conclude that this was because they were immigrants. Okay? That's just a fair warning from the start here. But is it true? Does Canada's justice system really have different rules depending on your immigration status? That's the fundamental question. Could a Canadian citizen really receive a more severe punishment for the exact same crime? Here's the lowdown. Yes, it is true. Immigration status can be considered during sentencing for non-citizens in Canada. Here's the legal background of that. In the 2013 Supreme Court case RV Pham, the court ruled that immigration consequences are a valid collateral factor for judges to consider when sentencing non-citizens. Hoang Ang Pham, a non-citizen, was convicted of producing and processing marijuana for trafficking. He received a 2-year prison sentence, which under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act meant he automatically lost his right to appeal a deportation order. Neither the Crown nor the Defense Counsel raised this immigration consequence during his sentencing. Pham then appealed, asking for the sentence to be reduced by 1 day to 2 years less a day, which would preserve his right to appeal deportation. The Supreme Court of Canada unanimously agreed judges may consider immigration consequences when sentencing as long as the sentence remains proportionate to the crime. This means that if a sentence could lead to deportation or affect someone's ability to gain permanent residency or citizenship, a judge might impose a lighter sentence to avoid these outcomes. The idea here is to avoid double punishment where immigrants who commit crime do the time and still get deported or something like that, right? Now, many people might be like, yeah, we don't want criminals in our country anyways. They shouldn't have a right to stay if they commit crimes. Also, why should a Canadian citizen get a harsher punishment than an immigrant for the same crime? See? You see how you can go with the logic there? Anyways, it is interesting that the Conservatives are pushing this now because when you think about it, this Supreme Court ruling actually came down in 2013. Stephen Harper was still Prime Minister then, as you might remember. If they really wanted to change this, they had 2 years before Justin Trudeau took office to do it. Of course, the Liberals have had 10 years afterwards and have done absolutely nothing about it either. But why are Conservatives talking about this now? The Conservatives said in their brief that the vast majority of Canada's immigrants and temporary residents abide by the law, but removing non-citizens convicted of serious crimes is a no-brainer. That was part of their brief as well. Here's my concern with this though. There is this narrative that has largely been imported from the Trump rhetoric in the US that the majority of crimes in Canada are being committed by immigrants. Look, I'm glad the Conservatives did not try to push that narrative in this brief. But do the numbers actually bear this out? Are immigrants actually responsible for most of the crimes in Canada? Luckily, Statistics Canada actually has a neat tool for this. It is called the Crime Severity Index. The Crime Severity Index is a statistical tool which measures both the volume and seriousness of police reported crimes across the country. It was introduced in 2009 to address limitations in the traditional crime rates, which treats all crimes equally regardless of severity. The CSI actually weights each crime based on its seriousness. So murder, for example, has a much higher weight than theft. If you're watching on YouTube, I will add a link in the video description so you can look at the data yourself. Anyways, what I wanted to do in this exercise was to compare the crime severity index in cities with high immigrant numbers to cities with low immigrant numbers to see if there is any correlation between high immigrant population and high crime here in Canada. I did a thing. Here are 5 cities with high immigrant populations and 5 that have relatively lower immigrant populations. Toronto, York, the Peel region, which is essentially Mississauga and Brampton in Ontario, and Metro Vancouver have some of the highest immigrant populations in Canada, estimated as high as 50% in some of these regions, right? Compared to Winnipeg and Edmonton, who have immigrant populations around 20 to 25%. Then you've got Regina, Saskatoon, and Sudbury, Ontario, which are around 10 to 15% immigrant population. So let's see the overall CSI here. You'll notice that these numbers here are way higher than these numbers, right? The crime severity index is higher in low immigrant areas compared to high immigrant areas. Let's break it down even further. In terms of violent crime, you'll notice that violent crime in these cities I selected is almost double what you'll see in high immigrant cities. You'll see a similar trend in non-violent crime as well. But maybe this is me cherry picking. After all, I chose the cities, right? I'm an immigrant. I have vested interest in making immigrants not look like a bunch of criminals mooching off the country. So I was kind of curious which city has the highest CSI in Canada. Well, that honor belongs to Black Lake in Saskatchewan with a CSI of 2,292. Don't worry, because it says Black Lake doesn't mean it is full of black people. I can say that because I'm black. It's actually a primarily indigenous community, so you can't deport them now, can you? Now, before people who already have biases against indigenous people run off with that narrative, I will say that Black Lake is a small community and a few serious incidents can drastically skew the index due to their small population. Look, my goal with this exercise is not to demonize any group of people. Personally, I think that the punishment should fit the crime, regardless of what passport you carry. However, I do not agree with this framing that immigrants are being allowed to get away with serious crimes because we don't want to screw up their immigration status. I do not think people are getting away with murder or armed robbery because, hey, we do not want to mess with their immigration status. There is simply no evidence of that. And I think you might find that the truth is a bit more nuanced than that. Anyways, I'll leave it there. I'm curious what you guys think. So get in the comments and subscribe if you're new to the channel. I'll see you next time. Take care, you guys.